Good afternoon, everyone. I make that about 4 o'clock by my watch, so we will start this presentation. Welcome to everybody. We're obviously disappointed that we can't meet you all in person this year at the usual Cereals event, which will be taking place later on this week. But of course, events have conspired against that. So this is our sort of substitute for the tour of the boards that we often do on the second day, or just meeting up with you whenever you can come along to our stand. So we just wanted to present the same sort of information as we would usually do at Cereals, perhaps just in a different way. So just a little bit on the admin to start with. Hopefully you've kind of all got to grips with the system a little bit. We have muted all of you as you sort of come into the conference, just so there's not too much background noise and feedback. There's a red arrow. Hopefully you've all got a control panel that sort of slides the control panel in and out. And really the reason for that is that you can still ask questions by typing them in under the sort of questions heading that will pop out on the panel that you've got there, and we'll hopefully kind of just answer all of those that come through, or as many as we can get through at the end of the session, which I probably should have said, designed to last about sort of 20 minutes. We're not going to delay you too much on a Monday afternoon. Just a quick, as I say, trot through the information that we would have presented at the Cereals event had we all been there. So probably only one place that we can really start with in terms of the kind of 2020 harvest is the very odd weather that we've had for a number of months now. The blue line that's hopefully just come up in front of you is the average rainfall over the last sort of 15 years, month by month. It's slightly surprising that September is so low, less than August, but that's perhaps just an anomaly we don't really see. That red line is the 2019 figure, always going to be a bit more random, a bit more bouncing around because it doesn't have the smoothing effect of 15 years worth of averaging, but hopefully we can clearly see that pretty wet September, October and November as well just led to very low levels of autumn cereals planting compared to the normal. And then if we thought things were going to get back to normal, of course they haven't done. Incredibly wet February, followed by a pretty dry March, very dry April, and an even drier May. So that dry spell has allowed everybody to pretty much catch up if they wanted to in terms of spring planting, but has also had an effect on the development of those crops that have been planted, and actually some of the winter crops as well. We've probably all had a bit of rain over the last few days. Whether that's going to do much more than settle the dust, remains to be seen. It's probably helped a little bit, but still, even then, a lot of crops have been suffering from a bit of drought stress, particularly on the lighter land, and therefore probably some yield losses have already, if you like, been baked into what we're going to have this year. A lot of crops out there just not looking very good at the moment. So likely to lead to a much reduced harvest. This is again another little graph just showing where we might be with that. We can see that the 2019 harvest was actually a very large one. A record at least 25 years, the largest cereals harvest we've had, driven to a large extent by good yields, but also quite high planted areas as well. Very, very different for 2020. We can see some big reductions, particularly in the wheat one there. Almost 40% output decline we're predicting for this harvest versus last year's. Barley less so, 10 to 15% down, but that's only really been kind of kept at that level by the large plantings that we've seen this spring. So actual yields well back in general, but just a larger planted area. So all of this would, all things being equal, have some effect on price for the upcoming harvest. We are seeing kind of elements of that. We've seen some sort of uptick in values over the last few months as it become clearer that we're certainly not going to get a bumper harvest, perhaps not as much as we might have thought. One thing to be sort of remembered is we're probably going to carry over a considerable amount of the 2019 crop into 2020, and that's just serving to kind of keep a lid on values, particularly in the barley market, where the COVID-19 outbreak has pretty much brought an end to sort of brewing, malting barley demand, really knocked that back. So quite a lot of barley rolled forward from one year to the next. With a potentially big-ish barley crop, then that does sort of spell some problems, we believe, in the barley market. Could be a big discount between feed wheat and feed barley and even malting barleys after harvest 2020. Of course, the UK is fairly insignificant in global levels in terms of cereals production. So, whether we have a great harvest or a small harvest perhaps doesn't necessarily move the dial all that much on prices, because we are plugged into a global market. It must be said that the dry weather crop problems aren't just a UK feature, are seen right across the sort of northern European wheat growing or cereals growing belt, right through into Russia, Ukraine as well. So there are some sort of wider market effects. US, however, hasn't really had the same problems. So obviously there's some parts of the globe that aren't seeing the harvest difficulties so far that we might be seeing. So that again perhaps conspires just to keep a lid on prices. So we've seen some firming, but whether it will be enough to offset the yield reductions is perhaps questionable, and we'll see how that impacts at the farm level in a couple of slides time. So just to kind of think about the sort of market a bit more, obviously 2000 harvest is going to be a bit of a sort of odd one in terms of marketing, because at the end of this year we leave the transition period, 31st of December, so we are no longer in the single market, no longer in the customs union, and therefore if we haven't done a deal with Europe, then we will be trading with them on a very different arrangement that we have done for the past few decades. So sort of halfway through the cereals marketing year, there could be a very abrupt change of trading practices. Because we've obviously had Brexit, but we are in the transition period, meant to last until the 31st of December 2020. It can be extended, but the deadline for agreeing that is the end of this month. So we'll expect to see a lot of high-level politicking over the next few weeks to see whether that extension is going to happen or not. Seems quite unlikely at the moment. The UK government particularly very adamant that Brexit means Brexit, and we are going to be out of the transition at the end of this year. So something needs to be put in its place in terms of us and Europe, a new relationship. When Brexit was all sort of starting many years ago, it now seems, we were promised the best trade deal ever, something like the one that Canada's got. CETA is the acronym that drives that, but it was going to be even better than Canada's one. Deep, comprehensive, covering trading goods, but also services, recognition of standards, NTBs and non-tariff barriers. This is all the sort of costs of trade, really sort of tied up in bureaucracy, if you like, the form filling, the inspections, the standards, the delays at ports, all of these kind of things, which can be adding quite a lot to the cost of doing business, importing and exporting. Seems, we are not going to get that kind of really deep, comprehensive deal. The time is just like has dribbled away. So we're probably going to get a fairly minimalist Canada Dry, we've called it, perhaps focusing on goods, no tariffs on agricultural trade, but perhaps some quantity restrictions, i.e., we could export X thousand tons of barley to Spain, but no more. And lots of arguments about standards, but we're unlikely to sort of see our standards align completely with Europe, which will bring in higher trade costs, higher non-tariff barrier costs, and any cost in the supply chain has got a nasty habit of returning down to the primary producer at the farm level. So that may also impact some market prices after the end of this year as well. Of course, it's not guaranteed we're going to get a deal done. There is the possibility of a no trade deal situation. So we would simply trade with Europe on the same basis as every other country in the world that we haven't got a specific trade deal with, WTO terms effectively. And that would mean there would be tariff barriers between us and Europe, both our exports to them and their imports to us. We'll come back to that in a moment. The sort of trade process is pretty much a sort of three-pronged approach. So we are talking with Europe, obviously, but we're also talking with other countries. The US has been front and center of this to get a trade deal with them, but other countries are sort of on the list as well. Australia, New Zealand, notable ones, particularly in agricultural terms. And some of this could have effects at the kind of farm level. Perhaps not immediately, might take you know, a good year, 2 years even, to get some of these other deals through, ratified and working. But in the sort of medium term, we could see some effects on farm from those as well. And aside from the people that we're trying to do specific deals with, we will also still be trading with everybody else. So the rest of the world, what's going to happen with that? Just over the last couple of weeks, the UK government has published its tariff schedule that will apply to every country that we haven't got a trade deal with. So the protection to our market after we leave the EU, effectively, what barriers are going to be erected to help our own agricultural industry. Perhaps slightly surprisingly, the UK government has decided to pretty much roll over the European level of tariffs unchanged in agricultural terms. So they've been converted from euros into sterling, but basically the level of protection that we got as members of the single market, we will continue to enjoy after the 31st of December in our own little UK single market. So that was a bit of surprise. We thought the government might go for some, you know, very cheap food policy, lower all these barriers, but at least in the short term, we've got a bit of protection from Ukrainian grain, you know, Brazilian, you know, beef, whatever it might be. So, you know, some of those protections will almost certainly be reduced in coming years once we start to do deals with people. But in the short term, at least there's a little bit of protection there from rest of the world imports. Other changes arising from Brexit, the other big one is support, of course. Just a little graphic showing how the basic payment scheme is going to phase out over the next few years. There's been sort of talk that it should be delayed, coronavirus, you know, delays in Brexit, but DEFRA seem very keen that the phase out in England, I should say, should start in 2021. That is the only year that we know the deductions for. They are going to be focused more on larger businesses, which hopefully the chart in front of you illustrates. After that, we don't know the deductions. We're sort of speculating in Andersons that they might be relatively low for the first few years because the new ELM scheme doesn't really get going till late 2024. So if you haven't got anything to spend the money on, why deduct it from the BPS in those first few years? We could be wrong about that, but that is our thought at the moment. However, in those sort of interim years, 2022, 2023, etc., there probably will be quite a lot of funding going for things like training, productivity, grants, all these kind of things, just ticking DEFRA's, you know, box that they want to see the productivity, the competitiveness of UK agriculture improved over the next few years. And as the BPS phases down, you can see the ELM, Environmental Land Management, phasing up. Of course, there is not going to be a single figure for averaged right across the country. Every single farm will potentially have a different ELM payment depending on what public goods it wants to supply to the public or the government as it is. So some probably won't enter the scheme, they'll have zero, the BPS will go, it won't be replaced with anything. Other farms may be well placed to get a lot of money from ELM. So very much, rather than the average, a sort of case by case on how much BPS can be recovered farm by farm. In the interim, as I say, it doesn't really get going till 2024, 2025. So funding under the BPS will start to reduce. So perhaps cereals farms ought to be looking a bit more, if they haven't already, at the countryside stewardship as a sort of stopgap measure before the ELM comes in. Lots of people sort of dismiss countryside stewardship. It didn't start very well, a lot of sort of admin issues. It has got better, and if you haven't looked at it for a while, it's perhaps worth going back to that. So we always at Cereals show our kind of Loam Farm figures. Loam Farm is a notional 600 hectare, very simple combinable crop business, notionally located somewhere in the east of England. So before we actually show the figures themselves, for 2021, our sort of budget for the next year, we've actually made some sort of fairly significant rotational changes. Like a lot of businesses in the east of England, Loam Farm, although it's sort of theoretical, it is influenced very much by what we see on our clients' farms. Its gross margin for oilseed rape has not been very good for a number of years now, and certainly for this year is showing a really sharp downwards tick. Over the past, the break crop oilseed rape has been the best break crop, and at times has actually beaten the feed wheat gross margin, or at least it's been pretty close to it most years. You can see just over the last few years it's opened up. Yield problems, particularly driven by cabbage stem flea beetle, and the lack of neonicotinoids just has made it a much more difficult crop to grow, and actually a much more risky crop. Part of the reason that we've dropped it in our rotation isn't sort of necessarily the results, although they haven't been great. It's that you kind of just don't know where you are with it. If it could be kind of know at the end of October, for example, that the crop had failed, then you could stop putting inputs into it. But it's a sort of crop where you've committed a lot to it and it could still fail. So lots of upfront costs, lots of risks, and therefore, which is why it's dropped out of our rotation. The black one there is our sort of classic Loam Farm, which we've been running for a number of years now. And basically, as you see, we've dropped completely oilseed rape out of it and had to sort of do a more complicated, you could argue quite cereals heavy rotation, but we feel that oilseed rape has sort of no longer justifies its place in our cropping. This is, as I say, east of England. There are alternatives out there, particularly if you're in the kind of north or further in the west, then oilseed rape probably still does have a place. Perhaps if you're particularly good at growing it, it still has a place. If you've in a more mixed farming area than perhaps Loam Farm is, then putting some grass into your rotation. If you've got an AD plant nearby, growing some maize, all of these are options. We've got some sort of lesser break crops, linseed we considered as well, even more beans, but we've got some already on the farm, so therefore we didn't want to overdo it. So all of these things kind of went through our minds and are going through the minds of growers as well out there at the moment, trying to find a sort of sustainable rotation. So where does that leave us in terms of sort of figures for Loam Farm? What we're showing here is on a pounds per hectare basis, sort of fairly sort of simplistic summary of the figures. This is all in harvest year, so that's harvest 2018, which you'll perhaps recall back, that was drought affected as well. Yields were compromised. Values weren't too bad, but yields were certainly back a bit. Even so, decent margin from production because prices weren't too bad. Add on the basic payment, reasonable business surplus. 2019 yields, as we saw back at the start of this presentation, much better. Values back a bit, but output at least went up. Quite a lot of cost inflation, variable cost, particularly fertilizer was a big one in there, and overheads kind of creep upwards as well. But a solid margin from production, again, add on the basic payment, a pretty good business surplus. So most businesses have had two okay-ish harvests, if not in physical output, at least in financial terms. 2020, you can see the output is a long way back. Partly that's because we had to change our cropping for this year as well. Planted some rape, some of it failed. We had to put more spring barley in as well to replace some of the wheat that didn't go in as well. That extra spring cropping has reduced costs, as you'll see, but has also reduced output as well. Overheads, we're sort of committed. We've got the labour, we've got the machinery. That can't change much. So all ends up in a negative margin from production, requires the basic payment to bring it into a business surplus. So probably one point that worth making there, in a tricky year like 2020 has been, at the moment, cereals production has got the basic payment to, if you like, bail it out, provide an insurance policy. In 7-8 years' time, that penultimate line isn't going to be there. If the farm makes a loss from production in 2028, then it will be making a loss. So that is the fundamental change of the phase out of BPS. 2021, it's the sort of first year of our new rotation. You can see that output sort of comes back to sort of more normal levels. It's a slightly lower cost system. You can see that in the variable cost compared across back to 2019. Does produce at the moment, solid kind of business surplus, and you can see the basic payments starting to fade out even from the 2021 year. So that just gives you some thoughts on where we are with Gnome Farm. Just a sort of couple of quick thoughts on sort of the future of cereals production. Certainly, when we look at our kind of clients' figures, controlling costs is the key to arable profitability, and the differences are very seldom in the variable costs, seeds, fertilizer, sprays. People are pretty much spending the same on that. It's the overheads, labour and machinery. How have they set their businesses up to do arable production? And very kind of quick rules of thumb. We've been using these for sort of many years, bit kind of not sophisticated, quick and dirty, but those are the kind of percentages of output turnover that we would be looking for in a kind of well-run cereals businesses to leave a target profit of around 15%. So you can just go in, do that very quickly, sort of proportional analysis, and see where the business is. But at a more granular level, we can see very large yield variations across farms. Different fields have got different yield potentials, and actually even within fields, there's massive changes in yields, which is highlighted by some of the kind of sophisticated yield mapping that is now available to people. So the question is, if we are kind of trying to focus on profitable arable production, why do we year after year plant areas of the farm that we know really aren't going to deliver any meaningful profit to the farm? What is the sense in doing that? So those changes can be done now, irrespective of Brexit, trade deals, COVID, whatever. Those kind of management improvements can really lower the cost of production. Just a quick note on rents. In our view, we think the BPS has elevated those and contract farming agreement first charges as well. Possibly you could say other input costs as well. Does the market charge what can be, what the market can stand? In the future, as the BPS phases away, there'll be no flat £230 per hectare coming into every farmed hectare in England. and therefore we believe rental values will become more, there'll be a bigger variation in rental values, firstly based on the productive value of the land. So if it can grow a good 11, 12 ton wheat crop, it's always going to be worth more than something that just grows 8 or 9 tons a hectare wheat crop. But also added into that, what is its other income earning potential, particularly around elms as well, and is it well placed to pick up some of those public good payments? So not just its farming income streams, but other sources as well. Even so, on average, we think that rents, there will be an adjustment once the BPS is taken out of the equation, maybe some time before a new normal is found. And perhaps as part of that process, just more working together between landlords and tenants to perhaps pick up some of these environmental payments, but also to address some of the more long-term issues around soil fertility, crop health, weed burdens, drainage, all of these kind of things as well, which need more than a 3-year FBT to sort them out. So final slide, just with an eye on the time, is just a summary of all of that. In the short term, probably some cash flow considerations to think about. Probably bank accounts don't look too bad at the moment. Decent returns from harvest 2019. Probably in some cases not as much spent on the crops for harvest 2020 as might have been the case usually. So not much going out of the bank account, but come sort of the autumn of this year, when the lower level of income from the harvest 2020 comes through, that might be the time when there's a little bit of financial pressure on bank accounts. Longer term, replacing that BPS is going to be the big challenge for the cereal sector over the next 8 to 10 years. By being better at producing profit from farming, but also picking up other funding sources, public goods being one of them, perhaps still room to go for other diversifications in certain circumstances as well. In terms of profit from farming, it is all about controlling the costs of production. Very limited opportunity to sort of add value, differentiate product in commodity combinable crop production. So therefore, it does tend to come back on being efficient, productive, low cost of production, all of the points that we've made out. Probably another agenda, it's gone slightly quiet on this because other things have taken up the public space over the last few months, but climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, that will be part of the mix that all farmers will need to deal with in the future. Particularly issues around break crops, finding a rotation that works for the particular farm in question, especially with oilseed rape becoming less favourable, and all the agronomic issues and how do we deploy new technology. Lots of fancy gizmos and whatnots out there. Whether all of them actually contribute to the bottom line at the moment, perhaps still questions to be answered on that. So that sort of brings us to the end of a very quick run through of some of our thoughts on the cereals sector. We'll just slide out the control panel and see if there's any questions. One other thing, if you have a look on your control panel, near the bottom is something called handouts. On that, there is a PDF of all the slides I've just gone through, plus there's some sort of notes that we've written to kind of go alongside the slide. So if you want to sort of copy a reminder of all that we've talked about this afternoon, then please do so. Just whilst I remember before I go on to the questions, obviously my contact details are on the screen. If there's anything that comes to you after the event, please do not hesitate to get into touch with us. If there's anything we can do with you to kind of work with you in a sort of post-COVID future, then we would be very pleased to hear from anybody. If you're a farmer and you want to kind of contact your local Andersons consultant, then please look at our website, www.andersons.co.uk. So adverts over, just to see if there's any questions on there. So I'm just having to expand it out a little bit because there is a question, but I can't read it very well because the layout is not very good. Sorry, I'm just perhaps what I will do, I apologise, the computer is not working particularly well, so sorry I can't pick up. I can see there's some questions on there, I just can't get to them because the computer's not looking very good. I will kind of answer those questions, I'm sorry, offline, and try and give you all a response to them. So thank you very much for that. Sorry about the kind of questions issues at the end there. Again, thank you for your presence online this afternoon, and we hope to be able to meet you all physically at Serials next year, if not in the meantime. So have a good rest of your working day and pleasant evening. Thank you.